Today, I will be speaking with Dr. Bessel Kolk. Dr. Kolk is a pioneer clinician, researcher, and teacher in the area of post-traumatic stress. His work uniquely integrates developmental, neurobiological, psychodynamic, somatic, and interpersonal aspects of the impact of trauma and its treatment. His #1 New York Times Science bestseller, The Body Keeps the Score, Brain, Mind, and Body in the Treatment of Trauma, transforms our understanding of traumatic stress, revealing how it literally rearranges the brain's wiring, specifically areas dedicated to pleasure, engagement, control, and trust. Dr. Kolk and his various collaborators have published extensively on the impact of trauma on development. He has published over 150 peer-reviewed scientific articles on diverse topics. He is the founder of the Trauma Center, now the Trauma Research Foundation in Boston, Massachusetts, past president of the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies, professor of psychiatry at Boston University Medical School, and principal investigator, Boston, Site of MAPS, sponsored MDMA-assisted psychotherapy study. And with that, we welcome you.
Delighted to be here.
Let's kick things off. There is some really exciting news that has come to light where MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, on the results of their phase 3 trials, has submitted to the FDA a request for approval for MDMA to treat post-traumatic stress disorder. I am wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what that process was like, what the study showed, and what the next steps look like for this road to regulation.
Well, it started off with Michael Mithofer and Rick Doblin many years ago proposing to use psychedelic agents for PTSD. And my particular take on it is they came to talk to me and asked me, what do you think about it? And I said, well, I'm a child of the 60s, so I certainly am familiar with these agents. And I know the research that was done, and it's good research, and would be a very interesting idea, because when you get traumatized, you get so constricted, and you get so stuck in your trauma, and you see the world in a very narrowed way. And I thought, theoretically, psychedelics make a lot of sense for trauma, but I also ran a symposium in 1994 at the American Psychiatric Association, where I called a whole bunch of people together who had done the LSD research way before us. And they were some of the most depressed people I've seen. And they said, we did this amazing research, and then we were criminalized. We lost our academic positions. And I told them I thought that the politics behind it would be too difficult to actually ever do the study. And they, as people usually do, did not take my advice. And they went ahead and did a study, which was an enormous amount of work. And I must say, Rick and Michael are heroes. And I'm not a hero worshipping type of person, but what they went through to do these studies and to collect money and resources just was nothing short of stunning. And so they did one preliminary study, then they did a second study that looked pretty good. They had to sue the FDA, court cases. These are very nice people, but they also are very dedicated people. And when they find an obstacle, they go and try to clear the obstacle. And so then they did this phase 3 study, and they asked me to be the principal investigator of the Boston side. We were only 1 out of 15 sites where the study was being conducted. At the end, it turned out to be an unbelievably expensive study, something like $62 million. And it turned out to be very worthwhile. I wasn't so sure that the study would work out, because the way it was being designed is that people get a total of 36 hours of psychotherapy by a group of very well trained and by and large I can't judge the other sites, but certainly at my site, our clinicians were terrific people, people you can trust with their patients. And I thought that the therapy would be so good that adding the MDMA to it probably would make that not that much of a difference. I thought that the therapy alone would make a substantial difference. And so, what's so great about doing research is you have certain ideas, and then your ideas turn out to be wrong. And most people who I know who want to do research want to prove their point. The real issue of research is that so? Is that real? And so it turned out that adding MDMA to the psychotherapy made an enormous difference. And there was another issue that when I joined the study, uh, I told my colleagues, you have to be careful who you select, because in the DSM they made a serious error by only including post-traumatic stress disorder. But a lot of people suffer from lifelong traumatic stress disorder. A lot of people have histories of childhood abuse and neglect where they never really got to feel life is safe or people will be there for me. And those make up a very large part of the clinical population that we see. And in my previous studies on EMDR and yoga and neurofeedback, that proved to be by far the hardest population, the people who had always been traumatized starting early on in life. So I told my colleagues, let's not stack the deck against us. Let's only get people who truly have post-traumatic stress disorder, people who had a good life for a while, and then something terrible happened, and that changed everything. I was again overruled, and boy, am I happy I was, because almost 90% of the people who came to the studies were people who had chronic history of childhood abuse and neglect, which we have been trying to uh, call developmental trauma disorder. Still not official diagnosis, but someday it probably will be. And these people did extraordinarily well. And so it turned out that uh, MDMA assisted psychotherapy was very effective for PTSD, which in and of itself was not such a big deal because EMDR is also very effective and some other methods are also very effective. But it was effective for developmental trauma. It's effective for these people who are so internally carry all that burden of lifelong trauma in them, and they were transformed by the experience. So the primary data came out, very helpful for PTSD, made it as one of the top 10 scientific breakthroughs in 2021. Um, and then I was in charge of the so-called secondary data of the study. And I think the secondary data are, in fact, the primary data. Namely, the secondary data were to examine how people feel about themselves, how they negotiate emotional issues, how they negotiate interpersonal relationships, how they see themselves. Um, these issues are very important predictors of treatment outcome. If you don't know yourself, if you can't feel yourself, if you don't trust yourself with other people, if you have no language for your internal experience, that really stacks the deck against you in getting better from PTSD. And what did we find in our secondary analysis is that exactly those dimensions that usually get in the way of people benefiting from treatment were dramatically changed. And so um, the issue of self-compassion uh, sharply improved. There's a word alexithymia, which probably most of your listeners are not familiar with, but alexithymia is a fancy word for being out of touch with yourself, not knowing what's going in out inside of yourself, knowing who you are, having language for your internal feelings. Um, and I certainly thought psychotherapy would be much better with that because you do a lot of talking, examining, than psychedelics, which is usually very quiet. And it turned out that psychedelics were very powerful to help people to feel who they were and to have compassion for themselves and to be able to tolerate and feel their emotions. But I think our study showed is that psychedelics have, I don't want to say unique, but I've not seen very much else that does that for people. Um, a unique quality to allow people to develop a loving, caring relationship to themselves, which allows them to go into very dark places and resolve it. It is really, I think, I'm just stunned by it. I know I'm 80 years old. I've done research all my life, and I really think this is the most important finding of my lengthy career in the field.
Yeah, it's quite stunning. Really exciting time to see the science evolve. You're coming off of, or let me rephrase, hot off the press is the Plus One article in which you're the first author, alongside senior author Rick Doblin, published just last week, The Effects of MDMA Assisted Therapy for PTSD on Self Experience. Is this the secondary data that you alluded to? And can you speak more about this publication?
Well, it took a long time to get all the data together. It was a very complex statistical work actually to get all these data in a row. But at the end, it really showed that these dimensions of personality structure that that, for example, if you feel chronically terrified, or if you're uh, fundamentally have a feeling that I'm never safe, people may do terrible things to me, then it's not something you could consciously think, but that's how your mind gets organized. Um, and if that's the case, you're always on alert for getting hurt. And when that's your basic orientation, which is impossible to change by being reasonable about it because it's a different part of your brain, um, then when you're asked to go into a painful place, you cannot tolerate it because it brings out all this insecurity and that fear of life being very dangerous. And what the MDMA made it possible is for people to go to very painful places having to do with the past. And there is something about MDMA and probably most other psychedelics also, um, they don't take the fear away. That some people say, "Oh, the amygdala shuts down." No, the amygdala doesn't shut down. People still get really feel a lot of pain, a lot of hurt, but there is something about these substances that make it give people the courage to go to very dark places where they have been incapable of going before. And when they do that, they are able to observe themselves in their trauma, in their abuse and neglect, etc. And then the issue of self compassion comes in, and people get a sense of, oh, that poor kid, look, his dad was so inadequate. His dad was always so angry and so hurt, and he took it out on that poor kid. And that kid, and they talk about themselves now, that kid, me back then, did the very best I could to deal with these very difficult circumstances. So there is something about the psychedelic ages that change people's perspective, and they allow people to have a sense that yes, this really happened to me, but it happened a long time ago, and it was not my fault, and I was not responsible for it. In fact, I was a pretty amazing little kid that I survived all these terrible things. And so your perspective changes, and to my mind, that's just um, you know spirituality always comes in, and I'm not a particularly religious person, but it's almost like a God sense. That oh my God, this is just amazing that we have something that helps people to accept themselves for who they are and to take care of themselves.
Incredible. A lot of your work, it really, it truly is. When I look at your area of expertise, we can see that MDMA is the star. I'm sure you're aware of a lot of institutions of higher academic learning looking at other different psychedelic modalities like psilocybin, ibogaine, even LSD and DMT in some cases. What is it that is special about MDMA, or mechanistically, what makes it different than the other classic psychedelics?
You know, I don't know if it is different. I personally have only had experience with ketamine and 5-MeO DMT. I had some psilocybin, LSD as a kid, and uh, and I'm very puzzled actually that they all seem to have very similar effects, even though like ketamine and MDMA are very different substances than ibogaine, psilocybin, mescaline, which actually belong to the same family, but ketamine and MDMA belong to a different family each. And since the study cost $62 million, I think it will take a while before we're able to sort out which drug is best for what. Huh? Right now, people say that ibogaine is the best for addiction. It may very well be. Right now, people say that MDMA may be the best for PTSD. I doubt it. I think we happen to have a very good substance, but I would be surprised if psilocybin or ayahuasca might not be able to produce the same results. So, uh, for me, this is really a very weird question because I hang out with people who are very familiar with all these agents, and I always try to pinpoint them what drug is best for what, and I never get a very satisfying answer for that.
Fair enough. I appreciate your take. I'd like to take a quote from your book here. You wrote, if the problem with PTSD is dissociation, the goal of treatment would be association, integrating the cutoff elements of the trauma into the ongoing narrative of life so that the brain can reorganize that was then, this is now. And as psychedelic assisted therapy evolves, the integration process is seen by most practitioners as crucial to sustained healing. Hopeful that you can emphasize to our listeners what integration is, and as your purview as a psychiatrist, how patients who undergo a psychedelic experience can do some homework so that the potential benefit garnered is applied to day-to-day life.
So that's a quote from my book. That's I'm oftentimes
Yes.
impressed with it. I knew that 10 years ago. That's pretty good because that's, I wrote about it mainly on the basis of my EMDR research, because in EMDR we really showed for people who had real post-traumatic stress disorder, i.e., they were okay until the trauma occurred. Um, EMDR really integrated memory into, yes, it happened, but it happened a long time ago. Um, and that really had been a major challenge with people with chronic abuse and neglect. And so basically, the nature of trauma, and everybody calls everybody a trauma these days, but the, you know, people are wired to deal with a lot of adversity. We have pushed out almost every other animal in the world in favor of ourselves. We are pretty resilient creatures. Bad weather or even the breakup of a love relationship is not quite a trauma. A trauma is something that overwhelms your capacity, that really just wipes you out. It is an oh my God experience. How can I possibly go on? And now we have a subtype of dissociative PTSD. But I think in some ways all PTSD is dissociated in that the experience is too overwhelming to take in, and the mind and the brain split it off, or are unable to integrate it. Said, yeah, that was really very unpleasant. That sucked, but now I'm okay. So the nature of traumatic stress is that your whole being is wired for the trauma, but the trauma is not something belonging to the past. It is going on a day-to-day basis. And that's the nature of traumatic stress. Ordinary stresses, uh, life sucks some of the time. You may have a difficult time, but before too long, it will be over. When you have PTSD, it just keeps coming back, and you're stuck inside. Um, um, the more dissociated people are, the more out of touch people are, the more shut down people are, the harder it is to treat them. And so, up to now, our research with neurofeedback was pretty good in terms of dealing with dissociation. Um, but the MDMA research was actually much better. That MDMA, actually, again, very much to my surprise, um, allowed people who were unable to feel before to make it safe for them to feel. And for people who are unable to remember before to actually have access to pieces of the past that they hadn't had access to, say, oh, that's what happened. Now I understand what happened to me back then. And uh, and then people have this deep experience of, oh my God, I survived that amazing thing. It hurt so much, but it is over. Huh? And not only that, there was another element that's really striking. Not only did they feel that way about themselves, but I know a lot of people, uh, including the very last person I talked to before our webcast, who always feel like it was their fault and they can't heal that old relationship, and they have really trouble coming to terms with the parents who were not there for them, who did terrible things to them. And then on the MDMA, people tend to go like, oh yeah, my father was this violent drunk because he was a very traumatized guy himself, and he went to the Vietnam War, or he was an immigrant or something. And not only do people have compassion for themselves, they tend to have compassion for their perpetrators. Stunning.
It really is. And to try to elucidate a little bit more information, bringing it back to integration. What does a patient need to do in order to move forward? What is integration? How can it best be practiced?
Well, it is very much a part of the therapeutic system. Huh? Um, there is now a tendency, as these things are about to become legal, and ketamine is legal already, to give people a pill and say, you do it. But what we did was very much MDMA assisted psychotherapy, and there is not a hell of a lot that you can do as you undergo the experience. You just need to take it in and take in the safety and the comfort that your therapist offer you, and allow yourself to travel, which may be quite scary actually. And then uh, all you can do is to observe and to feel what you're feeling. There's not anything that you should do in order to prepare yourself, aside from maybe setting an intention is very good. Like thinking, now I want to really go into my terror when I get intimate with somebody, how I cut them off and then mess up the relationship. I'd like to get some clarity about it. You know, most people, and I wouldn't quite do that because I'm still trying to be a scientist, say that the molecule guides you. The people who practice this, by and large, use language that of the medicine being a gift, and that there's some higher intelligence that gives this to you. And that's not the language I would use. I'm still sort of a sober New Englander who doesn't quite talk that way, but it feels indeed like a gift that's given to you that one needs to be open to. And indeed, when you go through it, you get clarity about this creature that happens to be you. And the integration is so important in that the experience itself is sort of an ineffable experience. You really have sensations and feelings and pictures and images and all kind of stuff. It is sort of a reorganization of your internal perceptual system. It doesn't have much logic to it. And the integration becomes very important in that you need to make sense out of what happens. And so after the psychedelic experience, it is very important for you to be with people with whom you can really try to understand what shifted, what happened, what came up. And I'm concerned that people may take these substances, have very deep experiences, oftentimes very painful experiences, and not be helped to contain it and to integrate it. But a lot of our subjects in our study said, I couldn't have gone there if you had not helped me, uh, if you had not been there for me. Um, I would have been freaked out were it not for the fact that I know you two know what you're doing, and that made it safe for me to go to these very painful and dark places. And then when the places come up, uh, all things, uh, there's all this controversy about repressed memories. In fact, I don't think you understand trauma at all if you don't understand that repressed memories is part of trauma. Part of something being a trauma is that it's too much for your little mind to contain it, and so there's stuff that sort of sits inside of you that you don't quite know, but you feel it and you have sensations, and then on these substances you get more clarity about it. But sometimes they're very painful realities. People come up with, oh, I didn't realize that my uncle wasn't the only one who abused me. And I didn't know that my mother actually pimped me. Or it's a really very, very painful realizations come out of it. And these are much too much to bear by yourself. Part of the trauma itself is that trauma is a very lonely experience, and not being believed, not being able to um, face the reality of what is happening to you back then is actually, and not getting the support you need, is part of the trauma. And so, in order to deal with the trauma, you now need to have people who are there for you and who can validate your experience and your attempt to make sense out of your life. Very important. Yeah.
Well said. It's interesting that it has become common for many people to compare a psychedelic experience with years of talk therapy. What are your thoughts on that take?
Well, I'm a years of talk therapy type guy, so I know that world. I've done it. I have quite a few patients who I've known off and on over 30 or 40 years who come and see me at different phases of their lives. And uh, people have long been suspicious of me. I don't believe in talk therapy. And that's indeed not the case. I think it's very important to be seen, to be known, to be validated, to have somebody who encourages you and helps you to explore you. So get very good psychotherapy is very important, but the psychedelics open up pathways into yourself that I have not seen happen with any other modality that I've been involved with. And I've been involved in. I've tried many different methods of PTSD treatment. Yeah.
The next question I have for you is one of an ethical quandary. There's ongoing debate in the field of whether or not a practitioner should have a psychedelic experience of his or her own before serving as a guide. Do you feel that it is important or adds to the experience if the psychedelic assisted therapist has had their own experience with a psychedelic to better help navigate the patient?
I wish there were no controversy about that. If you don't know what it feels like to have your mind blown and have all kind of stuff come up that you have not been dealt with before, if you don't understand the ephemeral experience, the fragmentary pieces that comes up, you should not do psychedelic therapy. I'm actually there's few things that I'm totally clear about, and one of them is that in order to be a psychedelic therapist, you need to have psychedelic experiences yourself.
Very, very clear cut. I appreciate your candid take on that. The next debate amongst the community seems to be one um, surrounded by this concept of microdosing, where patients have a regimen of taking a psychedelic that's below the threshold of perception. Whether or not there's a placebo effect, it's hard to study. And a lot of what you speak and write about is focused on macrodoses and having an experience that really shifts consciousness, perception, and awareness. So, having that background, I'd love to know what your thoughts are on this microdosing approach.
Actually, I don't know about microdosing, so I should not have an opinion about it. Um, I have some concerns about it. I think anybody who takes a substance for any length of time runs the danger of becoming dependent on it, of yet your ordinary self doesn't keep up with what the drugs give to you. So I'd be concerned about it, but I certainly don't know it. I've never done it, never studied it. So um, I'm, an, I'm an ignorant person when it comes to that. Yeah.
Okay, let's bring it back to your book, The Body Keeps the Score. In the opening anecdote, you tell us about Tom, a Vietnam veteran who chose to not take the medication that you prescribed to keep his nightmares at bay because he felt compelled to hold on to the memories of his lost friends. Many people suffering from trauma would be overjoyed to rid themselves of their memories and feelings, but yet they struggle to take the steps that might give them relief. How do you approach a situation like that?
The very first paper, it's not the issue of courage to go there is a very complex issue. And the notion that people are eager to get rid of their trauma is not entirely true. My very earliest paper I wrote about neurobiology of trauma was called Neurotransmitters and Addiction to Trauma. And what I noted there, it was back in 1985, uh, is that people who are traumatized seem to feel at home themselves when they're in their trauma, and they don't feel at home when they're not being traumatized. So many people feel alive when they're in violent relationships. They feel angry and upset and fearful, but they feel alive. But when there's no trauma, their brain doesn't feel alive. And so that's actually one very big thing is that your brain gets rewired for trauma, and your brain doesn't know how to deal with peace and quiet and pleasure, ordinary pleasures. And my sense is that the psychedelics may actually rewire your brain so you get to appreciate things that have nothing to do with trauma. There's this final scene in the Hurt Locker, which captures that beautifully. These guys go to Iraq. They're very good soldiers, very good people. They get traumatized in the war, but they're really very alive as long as they're in danger, and they come home and they feel nothing. And I see this all the time with war journalists and other populations that are chronically traumatized. When peace breaks out, they their minds and brains are not equipped to deal with peace. And so they seek dangerous situations, not knowingly, but obviously they do, because they make them feel alive. And I think that the psychedelics can actually rewire that reward system in your brain. It's huge. Now, this has been a very central question for me. How can we? It's the issue of pleasure. And that's not part of the DSM definition. But when you're traumatized, it's very hard to feel fully alive and feel pleasure. And paradoxically, you may feel more alive when there's trauma going on in your life. Uh, I used to see that very much when I also worked with gang members in the city of Boston. Uh, as long as there was danger, they felt terrific, but peace breaks out and they felt nothing. So this opens up the possibility of resetting the reward system of the brain so you can actually maybe enjoy shoveling snow or enjoy changing diapers of a baby.
You invoked the DSM, and I do want to ask you a question about that. But before we get there, because we are talking about the veterans, I want to get your thoughts on the VA and how they recently just acknowledged an effort to um, enroll veterans active duty members into clinical trials, and also funding that has been allocated to the VA in support of psychedelic research. Um, what do you portend in terms of the timeline? There's lots of discussion of MDMA potentially being approved by the FDA or the scheduling classification changed as early as this year or next. What is it going to take for progress to be seen there? And do you anticipate other potential pathologies and indications getting approval for MDMA assisted therapy?
Well, there's a lot of different issues in one little question. Huh? One is, what is the attitude about the VA, about trauma? And I hesitant to give you my total opinion about it because I think they have done a terrible job. Yeah? They prematurely sub, prescribed treatments that usually don't work and treatments that people don't benefit from. And everybody was forced to deliver those treatments. And even when it turned out it didn't work, for example, I did a first study on Prozac for PTSD. Um, and it showed that in civilian population, Prozac was great. And in VA populations, Prozac did not make one iota of difference. That didn't stop the VA from being the largest consumer of SSRIs for the treatment of PTSD, even though research showed it doesn't work. Yeah? So, no, the VA has a terrible track record of being open minded about truly exploring what helped for people. So now they're into MDMA because we have done the MDMA research, and now they go to jump on that bandwagon. And I hope they don't mess this one up too. Um, it's a large bureaucratic organization. It's largely a political organization. So that's my take there. If anybody wants to set me straight on that and say that, no, you're all wrong about it, VA has done a wonderful job with veterans, I would love to be straightened out on that. Um, and then there's the whole issue of the legalization. I'm not involved in that. And you probably don't want me to be involved in that because I'm not tactful enough to negotiate these very complex things with legalization. Um, but the great concern I have is that people are turning on the money spigot. And one of the many things I love and admire about Rick Doblin and Michael Mithofer is that they were never in it for the money. Uh, and they really were really motivated by truly trying to make the world a better place. What I see right now is a lot of movement to make money of this, and to I see some movement to take the same molecules and make sure that people don't get high on them or don't have mystical experiences. And I go like, why would you want to take away the mystical part of these drugs? Like this is all the old pharma business of behavioral health, just like let's fix your behavior. And so I'm really concerned that it will go the route that psychiatry has gone in general, just give people a pill and we'll fix them. And that is very much not what this work is about. This is about uh, having people getting to know themselves, having their consciously expanded. This is not about people behaving better. This is about people having a full and productive life. And I what I say to my team is, guys, enjoy the honeymoon. Uh, right now, these drugs are still illegal, and so we take them. I have a Schedule 1 license, so under the controlled conditions, we are allowed to administer them and take them. Uh, I worry about what will happen as big pharma and the money makers come in there. Yeah.
Yeah, I really like what you said there about uh, the discussion of certain groups advocating for taking the trip out of psychedelics. The way that I think about the paradigm and the current standard of care, you mentioned being involved in some of the early Prozac studies. The SSRI,
No, I did the early. I did them.
you did.
Yeah.
Kudos. And those therapeutics tend to really only treat the symptoms of trauma, whereas we are starting to understand that MDMA and psychedelics uh, work very differently and instead get to the core root of the problem rather than just treating symptoms of disease. And I did allude to the fact that I'm going to be asking you a question about the DSM as you invoked it. You and some of your colleagues developed a new diagnostic term for submission to the DSM that was ultimately rejected. Can you tell us about what went into the creation of the term developmental trauma disorder? And if you think we've seen enough shift in the past few years to be optimistic about its inclusion in future editions of the DSM?
It's a little bit like asking me about the VA. You know, the job of the DSM is not to help people. The job of the VA seems to be not to help people. I happen to have played a very small part in the original PTSD diagnosis and getting it in. And the moment that we got it in, which we felt extremely good about, um, a bunch of us noted that the majority of people in our practice don't have post-traumatic stress disorder, i.e., they're grown-ups who are functioning quite well, and then something terrible happens. And the majority of people in our practice have early childhood abuse and neglect. Um, at that point, back in early 90s, we worked together with the APA, American Psychiatric, to get a new diagnosis in called complex PTSD or DESNOS, disorders of extreme stress, not otherwise specified. I was the PI of that research, and we showed that early childhood trauma has a very different impact than adult onset trauma. We published these papers, but the APA decided to not include our recommendation in the DSM 4, this was, um, because Alan Francis now says that that would have meant that we would have needed to go into trauma as a contributor to all mental illnesses, and the field was not prepared to go there. Um, and so, even though our group, the PTSD group, voted 19 to 2 back in the early 90s to create a new diagnosis having to do with childhood trauma, that was kicked out. And since our practice continues to consist mainly of people with early childhood trauma for whom adult onset PTSD treatments are not all that effective, we kept pushing on that. And as part of my efforts there, I helped establish the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, a congressionally organized network consisting of about 150 sites around the country that actually look at the impact of trauma on development and how to treat children. And what came out of that is again a refocus on the devastating impact of having been traumatized in the context of your attachment relationship. And so, on the basis of studying 20,000 children and adolescents, we offered a new diagnosis for DSM 5 called developmental trauma disorder. Um, it is actually a disorder that probably was better studied than any other potential diagnosis in DSM 5. We did huge field trials on that are all accessible in the scientific literature, and they kicked it out again. And they said, oh, we don't have enough data, or we don't have enough prospective data to verify that early childhood trauma has a long-term effect on brain development. We sent them dozens and dozens of papers exactly about longitudinal data about child development. But again, the APA didn't want to go there and wanted to stick with the notion that there's a trauma that messes up your life. And so psychiatry continues to live in la la land of not really acknowledging the reality that chronic abuse and neglect plays a major role pervasively throughout the system. And so, what happens in the larger scheme of things, not in the US, but the WHO, the United Nations, World Health Organization, adopted complex PTSD, which is what we had proposed back in 1994. But we're still not into developmental trauma and into acknowledging how trauma at different phases of development has a different impact on mind and brain development. And that is, once we start doing that, we bring the soul back into our field by really understanding how the mind and one's perceptions and one's orientation in the world gets molded by real circumstances in your life. And that who how your caretakers take care of you as a kid has a major impact on who you become in the long range.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Can you talk me through the major differences in how you would treat adult onset trauma versus childhood trauma?
Well, adult onset trauma, it is an image of a sensation that keeps you stuck. So whenever you smell a certain smell, or you see something happening, or uh, somebody touches you in a particular way, you start feeling like this is happening to you again. And that's about a particular triggered emotional response to a particular incident. In my experience, for example, EMDR works extremely well for adult onset PTSD, which is about a memory. But if you have childhood trauma, it's about who you are. The way that people treat you becomes how you view yourself and how you view other people. So early childhood trauma really creates an entity, you. It is about all of you, gets pervaded by the trauma, and a lot of research, to some degree my own, also shows that if you have early childhood trauma in your attachment system, you view the world differently, you respond differently to minor stimuli, not trauma related stimuli. Your whole orientation towards the world changes. And with developmental trauma up to now, uh, we mainly used indeed talk therapy to understand what that kid went through. Back then, I did some serious neurofeedback research, which showed that we can actually rewire some brain connections so that people are less oriented towards danger, and you can help the brain to calm down. Neurofeedback was also very helpful. We find theater, martial arts, uh, sort of things very helpful for changing people's internal experiences themselves. So we're very much into body-oriented techniques, psychodrama, having people have experiences that really rectify those early experiences of not having been seen and not having been known. But to my great surprise and delight, MDMA really allowed people to go there more deeply than anything else that I have studied.
Thank you for that. I was quite intrigued to hear you say that culture shapes the expression of traumatic stress. I'm wondering if you could speak more about that and how do you see it being expressed right now and the interplay of culture?
Oh, of course, we are cultural creatures. A friend of mine at Tronic did his doctoral dissertation among the pygmies in the southern Congo. And he's the first person who really pointed out to me, said, uh, these kids, they have are completely different creatures because of their upbringing. And for example, if you have a whole village taking care of you when you're a little baby, you don't have this one-to-one relationship with a parent because there's a whole group of people around you. In other cultures, I've seen this also. Let's see, in Israeli immigrants to Yemen, is they don't have a sense of themselves. When you ask them what happened to you, they say, "My people, my village, my family," and they don't differentiate themselves from the people around them. America is a uniquely individualistic culture where we pretend like we are singular creatures and not just products of the environment that we all live in. And so you see this being expressed in different ways. And, you know, if you deal with somebody who is a Hindu from southern India, you deal differently than an Iraqi Sunni Arab, Muslim. They have different orientations, different values, different feelings of what's important, what's unimportant, different hierarchical issues. Very striking when you deal with Chinese people. That Confucian's system is alive and well in of all the Chinese people I've treated. Of I'm supposed to be part of a hierarchy, and I am here to kowtow to the people who are above me and to find my rightful place in the universe. That's not our culture. finding your rightful place in the universe and kowtowing to your elders is not exactly something that gets highly rated in the Bay Area, let's say. So we have different values, different orientation, um, different priorities in different cultures, and that creates who we are.
Excellent. And as we are nearing the top of the hour, I want to make sure that we are complete and comprehensive by inviting you to share any sort of safety considerations or any challenges that you anticipate should be addressed when considering MDMA and other psychedelic modalities for treating trauma.
Yeah, I'm glad you go back there because this is indeed the big thing. We all heard last 2 weeks ago that Matthew Perry had died in his hot tub on ketamine. uh, the guy happened to have taken ketamine, and then a neighbor of mine said, "Oh, I just had the neighbor who went to the hot tub with Pinot Grigio and was too drunk on the Pinot Grigio, and she drowned in the hot tub." I didn't see any headlines of Pinot Grigio kills people. Let's take Pinot Grigio off the market. So I think this is a very delicate moment. Uh, that anything that goes wrong, as like one of the MAPS study sites had somebody who very seriously violated physical boundaries. And it was a horrible thing. And of course, it made headlines. Now, there's big articles everywhere. Look, these horrible psychedelic therapists sexually abused their patients. No, one psychedelic therapist did that. And boy, am I angry that he did that because that really messed things up. So, this is a time to not mess up and to be really careful and to only work people who you really know. And you really must know somebody before you give them psychedelics. And you need to have safety agreements and agreements about touch and agreements about and have the knowledge about them, who they are. I just was in a I'll powwow this weekend again, and people talked endlessly about serotonin side effects. I said, God, let's get real. The issue that we should pay attention to is this person able to tolerate deep feelings? Is this person able to tolerate somebody's care? Is this person on the verge of suicide all the time? Does this person have some degree of mental flexibility? Does this person feel safe with me so that if they are scared, they actually can approach me about their fear? These are all terribly important dimensions that in our MAP sponsored research paid very close attention to. And so in our study, we basically had no side effects. At the same time, one of my team members just pointed out to me, remember, Bessel, not everybody got better. And that's also important to remember that nothing is a panacea, and things that work for one person don't necessarily work for another person, although our success rate in MDMA was extremely high. But the most important issue for me is an exquisite devotion to the welfare of the people you treat, and to really make sure that the set and setting are extraordinarily well taken care of, and that there are safety concerns at all times. I think everything that goes wrong will, at this point, be held against the psychedelic world in a major way. And so uh, let's be very careful. We also get supervision, share our cases with people, uh, videotape your cases so you can actually show to people what happened. You can look at yourself. I'm always a great fan of us videotaping our own work so that we can actually look at ourselves and see what we missed or what we did, because most of us are not all that aware about the moment to moment interaction. But this is a time to be very cautious and to be very careful and to really take notes and to collect the data.
Brilliantly put. And I am extremely grateful that we have been able to videotape this conversation and this interaction. For those that want to learn more, I encourage you to visit traumaresearchfoundation.org and besselvanderkolk.com for more information. And I'd like to turn it back to you for any closing thoughts, takeaway messages for our listeners today.
Well, Uh, Thank you for having me. I'm very delighted to talk about it. Of course, when you find these extraordinary data, you love to share it with people um, and take it seriously. Uh, I very much encourage you, psychotherapists, to really learn about what psychedelics can do for you and for the people around you. There's a tendency in mental health for people to get religious about a particular technique that they may have learned at some point. You see this all the time, and um, people say, "Well, how do this apply to Freudian psychoanalysis?" And I go like, "Why don't you just uh, learn about psychedelic therapy and see to what degree what you have learned before is still necessary after that or can be integrated. But first, learn how to do psychedelic therapy, and that's true for everything. And maybe the stuff that you've done up to now may or may not be helpful. Uh, Open up your mind to a really novel experience."
Thank you very much. And with that, I thank you, Dr. Vanderkolk, and I wish you well and all the best in your future research endeavors. It has been a pleasure.
Thank you. Delight. Bye bye.